France. He's the project director and the chief editor of the Berlin-based Hoshemadian website. He's also teaching at Freie University in Berlin, and his research interests include French colonialism, Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, and refugee issues in the Middle East. And the title of his presentation will be "The Story of a Speech: Debating Armenian-Turkish Relations in Istanbul in the Aftermath of World War I." And if there's a delay, we will start with the other speakers. That will be the only online presentation. Our second speaker is Andreas Baltas. Is a graduate of physical education and sports, as well as a graduate of political science and public administration of Athens University. He holds a master's degree in organization and management of sports institutions and enterprises from the University of Peloponnese. He received his PhD degree from the Department of Political Science and History at Pantheon University. He works as a physical education teacher in primary education and teaches social and cultural history of sports at the Hellenic Open University. And the title of his talk will be "Sports and National Ideologies in Istanbul During the Armistice Period, 1918 to 1922, the Case of Local Greek Sports Clubs." And our last speaker is Sona Baldrian, who graduated from the Department of Business Administration at the American University of Armenia in 2018 and completed her master's degree at the Department of Political Science and International Relations of the same university in 2021. Currently, she manages the Feminist Oral Stories project at Women's Fund Armenia. Her main research areas are reproductive justice, anti-gender movements, and feminist research methods. Welcome again. Is our guest ready? The first one? Arkadaşlar? Tamam. So Andreas, we'll start with you, if that's okay. Our speakers are really wonderful in terms of time management, so I don't think I will have to warn them. And then after at the end of the panel, we will have questions, Q&A session. Yes.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank Hrant Dink Foundation for the opportunity it gave me to be here and for the warm hospitality. The defeat of the Ottoman Empire in 1918 and the occupation of Istanbul by the armies of the Allied powers gave the opportunity to the leading groups of the local Greek Orthodox community to adopt the irredentist policies of the Greek state and to implement a nationalistic program on a broad scale with the encouragement of the Prime Minister of Greece, Eleftherios Venizelos. The activity of the local Greek sports clubs was also included in this program. The purpose of this paper is to analyze the activity developed by the sports clubs of the Greeks of Istanbul during the armistice period and its relationship with the Greek national ideology. The issues under consideration are the formation of local Greek sports clubs and their connection with the cultural memory of ancient Greece, the establishment of the Committee of National Defense and its patronage on Greek sports of Istanbul, the institutionalization of local Greek sports and the establishment of sports games, the use of mnemonic practices and Greek national symbols, and the competition of local ethno-religious groups through sports. Primary research was carried out in the archives of sports clubs of the time in Greece and Istanbul, as well as in the press of the time, especially Prodos Progress newspaper, whose issues concerning the period 1920-1922 were found in the archives of Estia Nea Smyrnis in Athens. The reforms that took place in the Ottoman Empire during the 19th century led to the modernization of the state and the adoption of new practices. Physical education was introduced into military schools and public education, while in the last quarter of the century, sports clubs appeared and expressed the political values and the new code of conduct of the rising middle classes. The presence of the Levantines in the major centers of Istanbul and Smyrna was a catalyst for the introduction of modern sports in the Ottoman Empire, and thus a new sports culture was adopted by the members of the middle classes of all ethnicities of the empire. Common perceptions of the body, masculinity, and well-being of individuals began to be formed then among educators and fans of all ethnicities in the empire. Thus, a common culture of physical education and sports was formed among the members of the middle classes of the Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities from the 1870s until World War I. The rise of nationalisms, wars between the Balkan states, and the irredentist aspirations of the non-Muslim ethnic groups of the empire inevitably affected sports as well, with the result that sports clubs functioned as carriers of the national ideology of their members. Great Idea, Megali Idea, which advocated the integration into the Greek state of all territories where solid Greek populations lived, formed the ideological framework of Greek irredentism. In this context, all Greek governments during the second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th implemented a program of homogenization of the Greek populations of the Ottoman Empire, which included actions and practices of national unification of the Greek Orthodox in Asia Minor, where sports had also a prominent place among them. In the last quarter of the 19th century, modern Greek sports were developed outside the borders of the newly formed Greek state, in cities where numerous Greek populations lived, such as Istanbul, Smyrna, Alexandria, Salonika, and Limassol. In this framework, Greek sports clubs of Istanbul were linked with the Greek national ideology through the connection with the cultural memory of ancient Greece and the legacy of the ancient Olympic Games. In addition, during the same period, the performance of the first modern Olympic Games in Athens mobilized the members of the Greek communities of Istanbul, leading to the establishment of the first gymnastics and sports associations, which they are listed below: Greek Association Hermes, Gymnastic Association Heracles of Kurtulus, Olympia of Robert College, Theseus of Boyadzikyoi, Gymnastic Association Ares of Arnavutkyoi, Gymnastics Association Perseus of Kumkapi, Alexander of Buyukdere, Gymnastic Association Achilles of Zimbali, Hellenic Gymnastic Association Jason of Constantinople, etc. Greek antiquity was the source of inspiration for the founders of these Greek sports clubs, as can be clearly seen from the names and symbols they adopted. It was the era in which, according to George Moss, under the influence of the national movements of Europe, I quote, "the cult of the nation, the culture of the national idea, which is composed of myths, rituals, and symbols, began to take shape." End of quote. The cultural memory of the Greeks of Istanbul was oriented towards the history and the founding myths of the Greek communities of the city, and according to Jan Assmann's theory, this past was condensed into symbolic formulas to which memory was attached. Through the rituals and symbols, this past was recalled, and thus Greeks of Istanbul were becoming aware of their identity. During the armistice period, Istanbul became the symbolic center of Greek irredentism, and sports of the local Greeks were also part of this policy. Since 1918, the nationalists of the Greek community of Istanbul took the leadership of Rum Millet and implemented an extensive program of promotion of the Greek national ideology, seeking to transform Istanbul into a state within a state, thus serving the irredentist policy of Eleftherios Venizelos. This program included speeches, poems, newspaper articles, announcements, and popular events. The performance of sporting events could not be absent from this program. In this framework, Greek communities of Istanbul organized sports competition very often. During the armistice period, these events acquired a strong national nature and were associated with Greek irredentism. In August 1920, and while the Treaty of Sèvres had been signed, the Greek Association of Sports Fans and Music Lovers of Arnavutköy decided to organize the third Pan-Constantinopolitan Sports Games, much, I quote, much for the demonstration of Greek sports as for the moral exaltation and domination of our ancient race against the foreign people who live in our city, end of quote. The games were performed under the protection of Greek Major General Katechakis, who gave himself the medals and diplomas. At the end of the games, a parade of athletes took place at the stadiums and the suburb of Arnavutköy. The defeat of Venizelos in the November elections of 1920 surprised and angered as well the Greeks of Istanbul. Thus, the representatives of their communities, political organizations and associations, the owners of the local Greek newspapers, as well as prominent figures of the local Greek society, elected a 12-member committee, which was called the Committee of National Defense, to deal with the new conditions. The committee collaborated with the officers who were devoted to Venizelos and who had taken refuge in the Ottoman capital, but also with the employees of the Greek High Commissioner, who had remained loyal to Venizelos. Members of this committee participated in the sports activities of their community as well to promote their political and national ideas. In June 1921, the anniversary of the unification of the Association Progress with the gymnastics club Heracles was celebrated in the presence of the Orthodox Church authorities, many officers of the Committee of National Defense, the president of the Hellenic Philological Association, and many others. At the beginning of the ceremony, the Greek national anthem was performed, and afterwards, Leonidas Iassonidis, a prominent member of the local Greek community, took the floor on behalf of the Committee of National Defense. After making historical references to the Greek Revolution, he expressed the devotion of the Greeks of the Ottoman Empire to Eleftherios Venizelos. He even declared that, I quote, even if King Constantine entered Istanbul, the Greeks of the city would welcome him with the anthem of Venizelos. End of quote. Members of the local Greek sports clubs used to express also their devotion to Venizelos on any occasion. On March 1921, Athletic Association Phidippides of Ortaköy organized its ball, dancing party, which was held under the protection of Greek General Ioannou and his staff. The young girl Despina Hadjiiliadou recited a poem which referred to Venizelos. The administration of the association also declared General Ioannou as an honorary member, and afterwards the Greek officers danced national dances. You can see in this photo very clearly the photo of Venizelos on the left. Connection with the memory of ancient Greece was particularly evident in sports activities and public ceremonies as well, mainly through the personal participation of everyone. According to Jan Assmann, the members of a community participate in cultural memory through the assembly and personal presence of each one. The fests and rituals transmit knowledge and define the identity of the community within from their repetition. It was precisely for these practices that Paul Connerton, on his part, introduced the concept of embodied memory, which refers to the conveyance of collective memory through embodied rituals. Okay. In the same period, 45 scout groups operated in Istanbul and the wider region. In January 1920, we read in the newspaper Progress that the groups of scouts had multiplied and numbered 1,000 members. The first groups of scouts were formed in the Club Hermes, and their members were originated from Peran and Tatavla, Kurtuluş. On May 17, 1920, the second great swearing-in ceremony of the Greek Scouts of Istanbul took part and young people marched on Sicily Avenue, Taksim Square, and the great street of Pera. On June 14, 1920, a great celebration was held in the gardens of Peran, Taksim, in honor of the victorious Greek army. Scouts parade, while groups of young people dressed in ancient and folk Greek dresses danced traditional Greek dances. The announcements in the press about the Scouts events were typical as well. I quote, "Everyone should come to the stadium today to celebrate the fest of the Greek Scouts. It is their day, during which we will have the opportunity to admire their organization, their strength, and the Greek vigor." Greek sports of Istanbul had acquired special characteristics compared to the sport of other ethnicities of the city, as local Greek sports clubs were functioning under the supervision of the Greek Gymnastics and Athletic Association and the Olympic Games Committee of the Greek Kingdom. In March 1922, several representatives of the local Greek sports and gymnastic clubs of Istanbul gathered in the office of the prominent member of the local Greek community, Timoleon Tagaris, with the aim of establishing an association among their clubs. The aim of the association was the communication and mutual support of local Greek sports clubs, the regular organization of games, the carrying out of sports statistics, and the enforcement of sports in every way. The choice of goddess Artemis, Diana, as the symbol of the association, which referred to ancient Greece, and the yellow-black banner, which was associated to Byzantium, highlighted the national orientation of the new association, and the timeless continuity of the Greeks of Istanbul was promoted as well. The role of YMCA to the spread of sports in the military during the period in question was very crucial. On May 27 and 29, 1922, the International Games of Istanbul took place at Taksim Stadium by YMCA. Sports associations of all the ethnicities of Istanbul participated in them: Turkish, Greek, Armenian, Jewish, Russian, YMCA, as well as the Sports Association of the English. Reading the results of the games, one finds a dominance of the Greek athletes, while the Greek football team of Pera Club won the first place. Thus, these games were an opportunity for the Greeks of Istanbul to certify their sporting superiority over other ethnicities. One of the provisions of the statute of the newly established Association of Sports Clubs of Istanbul was the performance of annual sports games under the name Artemisia. On August 12, 1922, newspaper Progress announced the performance of the Artemisia Games. According to the newspaper, the games would be attended by the Greek commander of the fleet, as a representative of the High Commissioner, the head of the Greek military mission, the head of the Inter-Allied Police, Maxwell, etc. Finally, the games took place on August 14, 1922, at Taksim Stadium, with the participation of 15 Greek sports clubs just before the collapse of the Greek front in Asia Minor. In the period 1918-1922, football teams from all ethnicities of Istanbul competed against each other. Teams of allied warships also were taking part in these games. Pera Club was the most famous football team of that time, dominated local football during the period 1918-1922 and winning the title of the champion team of Turkey. The leading football player of Pera Club was Konstantinos Negrepondis, later leader of AEK Athens. The importance of football victories is shown in an interview given in 1930 by Negrepondis. I quote, "Because you should know," he says, "that then we were not only fighting for the colors of our team, but also the prestige of our nation, our tribe. When we started a match, we thought very, very well that we absolutely had to win. If it was a bad day for us, then we made a double effort to become respected by the opponents. The idea that we were represented our motherland made us invincible. I confess that Pera Club owes so many of its successes to the training and discipline of its members, but mainly to the idea of the prestige of our race. We thought very well that if the team won, the defeat would reflect on all expatriates of the city, on all Greeks." End of quote. During the same period, boxing was also a very popular sport in Istanbul. Boxing matches were held by the Boxing Association of Peran in local theaters, and boxers from all ethnicities of the city participated, as well as soldiers of the Allied armies. The description of a boxing match of Greek champion Petros Maslumidis at the newspaper Athletics on March 16, 1929, is indicative of the competitive atmosphere of the time. I quote, "Petros Maslumidis defeated the champion of the English Fleet House at the Alcazar Theatre in front of thousands of spectators. For the past weeks, the press had been posting about this event. Maslumidis punched House and he fell to the ground covered in blood. The director of the newspaper Prodos, Konstantinos Panoudis, climbed into the ring and kissed Maslumidis on the forehead." End of quote. Incidents and testimonies like the above highlight the atmosphere of competition that existed among the spectators of the various population groups of Istanbul and the importance that victory had for each of them. Thus, one could say that in the stadiums and rings of Istanbul, a simulation of national rivalries was taking place. And I'm coming to my conclusions. Sports activity of the Greeks of Istanbul during the armistice period was a major aspect of the activity of this ethno-religious group of the city and was connected with the Greek national ideology and the irredentist policies of the Greek state. A key factor of this activity was the Committee of National Defense, which was established by the members of the leadership of local Greeks and formed its own strategy in cooperation with local allied military and administrative authorities. Loyalty to Venizelos and opposition to King Constantine were cornerstones of this activity. This was based on the institutionalization of local Greek sports through the formation of the Association of Sports Clubs of Constantinople and the performance of sports games. The main purpose of participating in games was to project the sporting superiority of the Greeks over the other ethno-religious groups of Istanbul and to boost the morale of local Greeks. The memory of ancient Greece and the use of national Greek symbols were also components of this activity. The collapse of the Asia Minor front in August 1922 and the Asia Minor catastrophe inevitably led to the end of this activity. Many members of the leadership of the Greeks of Istanbul who participated in it fled to Greece in the period of October-December 1922 to save themselves from acts of retaliation. Those who remained in Istanbul continued to participate in the boards of the sports clubs that were preserved with new names and under the new conditions of the Turkish Republic. Those who left were settled in the major urban centers of Greece and founded sports clubs such as AEK in Athens and PAOK in Salonika, keeping the memory of Istanbul alive and continuing to serve Venizelos party and ideology in Greece. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think at the beginning I missed saying the name of your paper. So Sona Baldrian will present a paper titled "Armenian Women in Post-Genocide Turkey, 1919 to 1921 from the standpoint of the Hygiene periodical. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sana Badrian, as I've already been introduced. I'm a feminist researcher from Yerevan, Armenia. And the paper that I will present today, I've been working on it for the past 2 years in grad school and also at my job. And I'm very grateful to the Hrant Dink Foundation for this opportunity to finally present it to the public. So my research paper studies Armenian women in the context of Istanbul's occupation through the articles written in the Haygin periodical. Haygin means Armenian woman, which was this Armenian women's magazine published by the Armenian Women's Association. The Armenian Women's Association, or AWA, was founded in July of 1919 and was the first women's organization in Istanbul to work on advocating for the political and educational rights of women and girls. Their bi-weekly publication, Haygin, was founded and edited by Haykan Ushmark, who you can see here, pictured here. She's second from right. This publication was published from 1919 to 1933. It is the only Armenian magazine or publication that was published after the Kemalists came to power in 1923. The first issues of Haygin, from the very first issues of Haygin, the discrepancies between wanting to be traditional women and enjoying the liberties of modernity are evident. Due to this, these times have proven to be full of contradictions and paradoxes for Armenian feminists. These were women who identified as feminists. This is not something that we, have called them retrospectively. Feminists such as Haykan Ushmark, Zaruhi Bahri, Zaruhi Kalemkerian, and others had to carefully balance between their national and gender interests. This is already evident in the very first issue of Haygin, where the Armenian Women's Association's plan is published. So glancing through the 9-point plan of AWA, I want to particularly pay attention to the 6th and 7th points, which are connected to the women's role in the private and the public spheres. So the 6th point states that the goal of AWA should be to keep Armenian women's traditional characteristics and educate her as a wife, as a mother, member of society, and citizen. Meanwhile, the 7th point, which is on the public role of the women, states that to wake in her the consciousness about her interests and rights so that she will reach the same level of material and socio-political position as men. We see that these two things are inherently at odds with each other. Apparently, the material and socio-political equality to men would be achieved through not changing the roles of women in the private sphere. This is what my research is mainly about. I'm interested in understanding how communal agendas in the public sphere have shaped the lives of women and girls in the private sphere. This research paper studies Armenian women's relationship to the public spheres of occupied Istanbul, be it the Armenian, Turkish, or Western public spheres. I start with the Western public sphere to set up the context in which Armenian women operated. Then I move on to the Turkish public sphere to show the inherent inequalities between the Armenian community and the Turkish state. And then I finally move on to the Armenian public sphere and its relation to its private sphere. My research asks 3 research questions, which are, the first one was, what was Armenian women's relationship to the civilized world? As you can see, I have the term civilized world in quotation marks. The second one was, what was Armenian women's relationship to the Turkish public sphere? And finally, the third one was, what was Armenian women's relationship with Armenian community power holders? As you can see, I've put small graph here to show this relationship and the inherent power balances between each of them. So when it comes to the Armenian women's relationship between the West, we have already discussed this, but the speakers before me have already discussed this, that the Ottoman Empire was considered to be the sick man of Europe, and the occupation of Istanbul to some extent was supported by local Armenians. They saw the Western powers as a force that could balance out Turkish state power and give them time to revive the nation. With the promise of Wilsonian statehood, the occupation of Istanbul was more of an opportunity than a threat for Bolsahais, which are the Armenians of Istanbul. As many of these Bolsahai women were well educated and spoke many languages, most notably French, their articles in Haygin periodical show familiarity with Western politics. And we see also this in their efforts in lobbying for the Armenian cause in the West, as well as their analysis of Western feminist movements. Here you can see Haykhan Ushmak, who is portrayed as a suffragette. And here you can see Zari Kalemkerian, one of the main contributors to Haygin periodical. She is returning with her grandson from the US. And she is also involved in advocating for the Armenian cause. And Armenian women actively advocated for the Armenian question, Armenian cause around the world, and this was one of the main goals of Armenian Women's Association. This had a lot to do with how they viewed Western powers. From the very first editorials of Haygin, Haykhan Ushmak starts with, the great Western diplomacy sees us, Armenians, as the torchbearers of the East. Humane foreigners are dealing with our fates. An example of these lobbying efforts is a poem found in Haygin that had previously been published in the Seattle Sunday Times in 1919 after a fundraising event for Armenia. I have a rough translation of the poem here. This is the poem. Oh, the West, where the people govern. Perhaps God told you to help the countries of the East, where disaster reigns. Oh, Western country, oh, free world, oh, America, Armenia is calling for you. The emperor, the sultan, the czar murdered my son. The rivers are red from my blood. Destroyed are my fields and hills. Oh, the Western world, where people are the rulers. It's God's will. Your flag represents peace. To the Eastern world where disaster reigns. Oh, Western country, oh, free world, oh, America, Armenia is calling for you. Evidently, the author, and to some extent also the Armenian Women's Association, see Western powers as saviors, there to save Armenia from the savagery of the Eastern world. And when I say that Armenians and Armenian women were well versed in Western politics, I do not mean it in a sense that they were critical of the material conditions that Europe and America produced in their respective colonies. I mean that they are well versed in spreading the imperialist narratives perpetrated by the West. So this uncritical look at the West and the promotion of the white savior narrative was a big misconception on the part of Armenian women that also led to political miscalculation on how trustworthy and willing these Western allies were. I want to move on to the question of Western feminism. In a lot of in a lot of issues of Haygin, you can find many articles on Western feminism and the feminist movement in the West. So Armenian writers have had the opportunity to criticize and add their own opinions on this issue. The Armenian writers and the contributors to Haygin recognize the role women play in the private sphere and make sure to get it across that they do not want to go against the established norms in the private. What they want is compensation for the work they do in the private, in the form of access to the public. For instance, in the very first issue of Haygin, author Hipsime Arabian analyzes the feminist demands on relationships, politics, and the economy. So I want to focus here on the issue of sexuality. She cites physiological differences between men and women for why women who seek free love would become prodigal and doomed. It states that the woman who seeks freedom of love is a paradox that will be a catastrophe for humanity. So their criticism of Western feminism is not limited to the issue of sexuality, of course, but because of time restrictions, I can't go into much details. I wanted to mention this example. We see elements of liberal feminism here that often take issue with more radical forms of organizing. We see how they take issue with feminist protesters and their methods, calling them unwomanly. Let's move on to my next research question, which was on the Armenian women's relationship with the Turkish public and private spheres. So the Armenian genocide was committed through a calculation of who will transmit Armenianness, and therefore it was gender and age conscious. Though Armenian women and children weren't considered to be carriers of Armenianness. And due to this reason, they survived in greater numbers, the genocide, and they were integrated into Turkish families by being abducted by them. So the Mudros Armistice had a clause on the release of prisoners of war, which the Armenian community saw as a green light to liberate the Islamized Armenian women and children from Turkish households. So therefore, the occupation years served as an opening for national revival through orphan gathering missions, in which AWA members actively participated. In an article from Haikin, Zaruhi Bahri, who was one of the most prominent members of AWA and very prominent in the community, talks about a recently liberated 6-year-old who, when asked about their nationality, said, "I am a Turk. My mother was a Turk, but my father was Armenian. That is why the Turks killed him. My mother told me before she died." Bahri continues then, "This is what our mothers did in exile, in misery, Islamized, everything lost. They did not forget in the last minutes to teach their child that their fathers were Armenian." Armenian women and by extension the Armenian community saw the children as a way to revive the nation. This is why the Armenian Patriarchate decided that every child born to an Armenian woman was Armenian. This fundamentally changed the ideas of patrilinearity that existed in Armenian family institutions before the genocide. This was, of course, done to increase the number of Armenians so that their cause for self-determination would be more legitimate. However, not all of these women wanted to have these children. Some of them were raped by their abductors and sought to have abortions. These women were accused of infanticide for wanting to terminate their pregnancies. I can talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A session if anyone is interested of any examples of this happening. This embracing of natalist rhetoric and puts additional pressure on the Armenian women's bodies, as if to tell the Armenian women that the only valuable role they could play in the nation building was childbearing. Here I also want to focus on an article called "Mental Health of Young Girls Who Forcefully Became Mothers" by Zgohar Kazmelian. It talks about how teenage girls who have been victims of sexual violence and as a result had children, hated motherhood and were failing at it. It says that society should not blame them, but instead the Armenian Red Cross and AWA should work together to make sure that these young girls are allowed to learn how to become good mothers. Here is a quote from the article. "Hardly mature enough to understand what the world is like, they fell into the hands of these monsters and became a toy of their passions. Now that they are mothers, they drag their existence, cursing the world and the child they gave birth to." We see just how common it was for victims of sexual violence to be victimized twice, once by the Turkish state, then by Armenian community organizations. This, of course, brings us to the issue of prodigal women. And these were women who had to turn to prostitution / sex work to make a living. This could have been returning women liberated from Turkish families whose families did not accept them back, or this could have been women and children who did not have families at all. In the March of 1920, the editorial by Haikanush Mark says that returning women are morally dead. They can't raise a good nation, and they have to turn to prostitution to make a living. The first issue of August 1920 starts with an editorial about Meru, which in Armenian means bee. This is a workshop under the leadership of Simon Gaisrelian that was taking care of prodigal women's vocation. The issue of prodigal women was, is, and will continue to be, says the article. It mentions that it would be unfair to expect that AWA will deal with this issue as well, and that the individual efforts of the community members would be enough to solve this problem. It mentions Armenian rich women, saying that they should follow Madame Gaisrelian's example and individually provide relief for Armenian poor women to prevent them from moral degradation. The editorial ends by stating that moral lectures without financial support are in vain and not useful for keeping Armenian women and girls away from sex work. If we are honest in our wishes, if we truly want to keep them away from their downfall, our talk and money should go together. It is important that Haikin is trying to shift the focus from moral lectures to financial aid to these women, recognizing that it is poverty and abandonment by the community that has led these women to sex work. However, saying that, that the individual efforts of the rich women would help to solve the problem of mass poverty seems a bit naive on the part of the editor. Moving on to my last research question, where I study Armenian women's relationship to Armenian communal structures and community power holders. As I've already said, our Armenian women's national and gender interests are at odds throughout the occupation. We see how they are trying to balance between nationalism and women's rights advocacy. For a long time, elite Armenian women saw, this is even before the genocide, saw nationalism as a necessary reaction to what the Armenians of Ottoman Empire have been through. In an editorial from December 1919, Haikanush Mark writes, "Let it be putting yourself into the narrow-minded scope of nationalism when we say that now more than ever we need to be nationalists, if that is how some understand the responsibility to love your nation." The editorial shames those who are ashamed of their Armenian ancestry, at home or abroad. It continues, "We should not be ashamed of being Armenian. The opposite. We should be proud. History considers us one of the most enlightened nations. We were the first to adopt Christianity. We are economically developed, smart, sharp, and hardworking." Here we see the responsibility to contribute to the production of national myths. Another interesting aspect of Haikin's articles on nationalism is this class tensions that exist between Armenian rich and poor women, as well as its educated middle class and small business owners. So Haikin's articles frequently shamed rich women for not doing enough for the nation and spending their money on lavish lifestyles. Haikin's article would often call on rich women, saying that the issue of national revival rests upon the shoulders of a few women engaged in those organizations, and a few are joining the cause. One of these articles says that whenever asked, other women excuse their non-participation by saying they are too busy, too delicate, or bring some other excuse. It calls upon women to start organizing in their neighborhoods, whether it is for the church, lyceums, theaters, or language cultivation efforts. It tells them to wake up from sweet dreams and engage in reconstruction efforts. Since I talked about Armenian women's role in orphan gathering missions and anti-abortion policies, here I want to focus on their role in advocating for women's rights. So in 1919, two MPs had requested that Armenian women get the right to vote in the Armenian National Assembly. And the editor, Haikanush Mark, threw her support behind this initiative, saying that Armenian women are half the nation and they have obligations as well as rights according to that. Mark says that women have responsibilities, but they also have rights. And even though she does not endorse women abandoning their roles, which would be an ugly act. again quotation marks because I'm quoting her, the women in the National Assembly are not just for decoration. They also work hard in service of the nation. The second issue of May 1921 starts addressing with the accusations made against Haygin in two journals published in Constantinople and Smyrna, respectively. So there have been made some accusations against Haygin that it was engaging in anti-Armenian politics for advocating for women's rights. So the slanderous accusations were published because of the publication's push for Armenian women's rights in the National Assembly. And the editorial argues that being a politically active woman does not make one forget her domestic responsibilities. It says, however hard the administrators, referring to the men in the National Assembly, try to stop women's participation, progress and reform are inevitable. Here I also want to mention this article by Anais, in which she says that Armenian women, in which she talks about how the Armenian community views the question of Armenian women's rights. She says that intellectuals realize that women do not enjoy the rights that they deserve. The conservatives think women and gender equality are immoral questions Armenians should not be bothered with, while the public is rather reactionary and relies on its intuition when it comes to these issues. This shows how hostile the overall environment was to women's rights and feminist concerns. And my last slide is the conclusion. In conclusion, nation building in post-genocide Turkey was a gendered process, often done at the expense of Armenian women's agency and physical bodies. Armenian feminists tried to achieve gender equality while also holding patriarchal ideals and beliefs, which ultimately made their demands seem inconsequential. They strived for the best for their community, often privileging communal agency over the individual agency. This often harmed the very women whose rights they were trying to protect. Overall, this research is a case study of how the patriarchy limits our imagination to strive for a better world. Thank you.
Hello, now we have our last speaker. Hello, can you hear us? We can't hear you.
Now it's done. Yeah, I'm hearing you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, the floor is yours, please.
Oh, thank you. So first, I'm very sorry for not being on time. Yeah, I feel lost by change of times between Berlin and Istanbul. But at least I know on what times I will speak today, and aftermath of ceasefire in November 1918. So the Armistice Declaration was followed by the occupation of Istanbul by victorious Allied forces, mainly the British. And this is a period marked also by the liberation of the Armenian deportees. Many survivors of the massacres returned to their homes with the hope to start a new life. That means a new chapter was opening in the history of the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire. It was also historical period for occupied Istanbul, and by this way, for the whole Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Parliament was still working. Turkish newspapers were released, and there was a new public space for political debate and discussion. I shall here recount an episode that will help us understand the significance of the moment. And this was about a debate that raged in the Armenian press in Istanbul, Izmir, Aleppo, Adana, and elsewhere. And despite its Armenian connotation, the debate concerned the Turkish-Armenian relations, or more precisely, what remained of those relations in the aftermath of the genocide, and what perspectives the occupied Istanbul was offering for its development. The debate was touched off by a speech by Artin Efendi Boshkezenian, a native of Aintab, a former member of the Committee for Union and Progress, and a representative from Aleppo in the Ottoman Empire, in the Ottoman Parliament. What did Artin Effendi declare in his speech? Taking the floor of the Parliament on 5/18 November 1918, he said, I quote, "The Turkish nation today stands accused before the civilized world. Today there is an enormous crime which stands as the most sorrowful and bloody page of Ottoman history. The immense crime which has shaken both heaven and earth is known as the massacre of the Armenians, the Armenian calamity," end quote. And the deputy from Aleppo went on to describe the perpetrators of this mass crime, quote, "For this reason, the Turkish nation is accused, but the real perpetrator is not the Turkish nation, but the former Turkish government and administration. The nation is one thing, the government is another. I say that this great crime, of which an entire nation stands accused, was carried out by the former regime, or more correctly, by the hooligan regime," end quote. Yet, Artin Effendi also pointed out that in a number of places, the common people of the Ottoman Empire too had taken part in the crime. And he said, I quote, "Those responsible for this evil are the kind of people who are incapable of weighing up the consequences of their acts. If sheep fall into a swamp, who is to blame? The sheep, the bellwether who led them into it, or the shepherd who took them from the fold? I say that while some among the multitude may have had a hand in the crime, the real culprits were their leaders, the state officials," end quote. As the native of Aintab was speaking, a representative from Trabzon, Hafez Bey, interrupted him to declare that a relatively small number of Ottoman state officials had participated in the crime. Artin Effendi reacted immediately, quote, "There were not just a few of them, there were many more than you think. If I were to list their names, one by one, night would fall before I was through," end quote. And the representative from Aleppo then turned to the question of arresting and punishing all those responsible for the massacres without delay, remarking that that was an obligation incumbent on the state, on the Ottoman state. And he added that it was also the state's task to free abducted Armenian women and orphans and to see to it that the Armenians received reparations for the material losses they had suffered. At first sight, it may seem that there is nothing uncommon in this speech from the victim's point of view. On the contrary, it may even seem audacious given that it was delivered in an assembly still dominated by the idea that the Armenians had been deported for acts of treason toward the Ottoman Empire. Yet, a storm of protest against Artin Effendi broke out in the Armenian press in the weeks following his speech. His remarks came in for ferocious attacks that he was the object of personal attacks as well in the form of article dishonoring him. The central target of the criticism was Artin Effendi's contention that the empire's former government was mainly to blame for the crime, not the Turkish people collectively speaking. Gebenyan, for example, a journalist from the Armenian newspaper Haytsayn in Aleppo, expressed a diametrically opposed view. Quote, "We cannot call a single Turk good or attribute a single Turk's friendly behavior to pro-Armenian feelings. Those who truly tried to help Armenians cannot be called Turks. Those who imagine that any Turk at all harbors human feelings can't be called Armenians," end quote. So it is obvious here that the genocide had seriously perturbed Armenian-Turkish relations. In the minds of many Armenians, like this journalist from Aleppo, the words Turkishness and Turk had taken on a new coloring and definition. Artin Effendi's words had scandalized many Armenians to such an extent that another journalist, Jumbushian, writing in the Istanbul Armenian newspaper Verchin Lur, objected to the Armenian parliamentarian speech on the one hand, while observing on the other that Armenian nation bore no blame for his words. I quote, the bodies of people of Boshkezenian's ilk are Armenian, but their souls are not, end quote. The rage and insults can also be observed in writers whom the deportation had led as far as Derzor and who had only recently returned, such as Yervant Odian or Kevork Mesrop. For example, Mesrop writes, I quote, "You do not speak on behalf of the Armenians, gentlemen. Speak on the Ittihad's behalf and in its spirit. The Ottoman Parliament is not the tribunal to give a fair hearing to the Armenians' case. You may be sure of that. Have the decency to blush, gentlemen. Do not toy with the misery of your race." End quote. And many Ottoman Armenian intellectuals who participated in this press campaign against Boshkezenian argued that the party responsible for conceiving and executing the plan for genocide was Turkish society as a whole, toward which they now adopted an intolerant attitude. The Istanbul Armenian newspaper, Norgyank, wrote, I quote, "A united Ottoman fatherland, all that must now be regarded as history," end quote. And the same Kevork Mesrop, who was deported in Derzor, explains, and he was addressing in this case the Turkish intellectuals generally, I quote, "You are all Ittihadists, if you are afraid to say so. We state the matter plainly and demonstrate that the Ittihad is the one national Turkish party to which you have given birth, which you have fed and raised, which you have supported and will support in future," end quote. Such Armenians considered all talk of solidarity and coexistence to be inappropriate. We read in this regard again in the Armenian newspaper Norgyank of Istanbul, I quote, "That fraternal solidarity was ruptured on the day when the Armenians, dripping with sweat, were slaughtered in their fields by their brothers' knives, when their wives and daughters were ravished before their eyes, when the desire to shatter the foundations of their existence made itself felt with a barbaric savagery never before recorded in history," end quote. So one is left with the impression that Artin Efendi had, with these simple words of his speech, sparked a debate among the Armenians about the Turks' collective responsibility for the genocide or the question of their collective guilt. To forgive or to punish, to remember or to forget. It seems that the debate could have developed further, taking on fundamental significance in the formation of the modern post-war Ottoman society that Artin Efendi himself so ardently championed. Germany, after all, went through the same stage. After the Nazi defeat, we know a similar debate, when the country was occupied by the Allied powers, had sprung up around the central issue of collective guilt, collective liability, and collective responsibility for Nazi crimes. But the comparison, however, stops here. True, in the conditions brought on by defeat and occupation, self-criticism and self-reproach had begun to manifest themselves in Istanbul Turkish newspapers. The Armenian press and politicians such as Artin Efendi had with this question assumed a historical role and were often the stimulation or driving force behind this progressive phenomenon. It is even possible to speculate that Turkish intellectuals' attitude could have evolved to the point of entertaining the idea of a collective responsibility, a development that would probably have had a positive influence on the Armenian side, dispelling their extreme suspiciousness and terror and instilling in them a degree of confidence about the prospect of continued coexistence with the Turks. Yet, all this turned out to be no more than a short phase in Turkish history, lasting barely 1 year. It is well known that thereafter, modern Turkey struck an altogether different course, and that this nascent debate would be nipped in the bud. The Armenians' rupture with the Ottoman Turkish world. So such was the main idea informing the reactions to Artin Efendi's speech. It would gradually be sanctified by Ottoman Armenian intellectuals in light of the geopolitical transformations then rapidly taking place at that time. The fact is that the genocide and the military defeat of the Ottoman Empire had ensured the ascendancy of the idea that the Armenians no longer had a place in the Ottoman system. New borders were being drawn and new states were coming into existence. The Armenian press and Armenian community and national organizations were also steeped in the spirit of these historical transformations, and the idea that the Armenians should seek their future outside the Ottoman state was steadily gaining ground. Artin Effendi was struggling against this new, resolute, commanding current. He had come to resemble an obsolete legacy of the past. He was rowing upstream, his bark was frail, and it was rocking perilously on the wild waves of a sea which was unfamiliar to him. At the same time, however, the victorious allies lacked the strength and the will to impose a new and different future on Ottoman Empire, while Turkish society was giving birth to a Kemalist movement that would lead it to victory after victory, but also to denial of the crime. The Armenian elite, for its part, had put its trust in the allies and their promises of free development, independent of the Turks and separate from Turkey. In these conditions, Artin Effendi was repeating ideas that now seemed untimely, even treacherous. In the same period, the parliamentary deputy and native of Aintab gave an interview to the Turkish newspaper Member. Member's reporter asked him for his opinion of the US President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points and the ways and means of implementing them. The rapidly shifting developments then occurring on the political stage had plainly thrown this Ottoman Armenian representative of the old school into a state of severe shock. He had witnessed the annihilation of his people by his own state, and now he was witnessing the slow disintegration of that same state and the dismemberment of the empire. The whole world of the past was crumbling before his eyes. The man was clearly groping in the dark, yet he endeavored to keep faith with his principles. And he declared that for him, the first priority was to see justice and equality brought about. I quote, "Let justice be done whether by the hand of a Wilson or a Lloyd George or even that of a Turk," end quote. And what about Wilson's principles, the right of the peoples to self-determination? The answer of Artin Effendi is the following, I quote, "There's the sticking point, and it's beyond my understanding. That there must be equality surely can't mean that separate government ought to be established in one and the same country. Muslims and Christians have never been equals in this country. What I seek is equality. My honor, my possessions, my soul must be safe. Let whoever wants to ensure that, as long as the vintage is brought in, the vineyard can belong to anyone it likes," end quote. And to conclude, at bottom, the two Armenian currents, Artin Effendi's and the one opposed to him, radical and nationalist, closely resembled each other in their weaknesses and helplessness. Both represented surviving remnants of the fragmented, utterly exhausted Armenian community. Both relied on a powerful external force to ensure their future development. In Artin Effendi's case, this force was the contemporary Ottoman state. He wanted to believe that this time the new regime would adopt another course based on the equality of all citizens without discrimination and on the principle of respect for human rights. He had placed his bets on Turkish intellectuals and the Turkish elite. He had hoped that they would be won to progressive ideas and universal human values, and that this would guarantee he and his fellow Armenians would continue to live side by side with Turks. Yet, the genocide and liberation had given rise to a new dividing line. Evidently, solidarity and coexistence with Turks was now deemed unacceptable. On the other hand, the rise of the Kemalist movement, its political and military successes, the end of the occupation of Istanbul put an end to any serious and effective debate on Turkish collective responsibilities for the genocide. Thank you.
Thank you all for really inspiring presentations. Soruları alalım isterseniz. I also have some questions, but let's get the questions.
Hello, this is Engin Kılıç. Thank you indeed for the illuminating presentations. My question is for Professor Baltas. Could you please tell us a little bit more about the aftermath of these Greek sports clubs? Are there any other clubs that moved to Greece after the war, apart from PAOK and AEK and Panionios? Or are there any which was transformed into Turkish clubs later on? And lastly, how are they, for those who moved to Greece, what is the perception of those teams in Greece? Did they create sympathy or antipathy? How were they perceived? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. The members of the leadership of the Greeks of Istanbul, as I said before, left to Greece in order, to avoid acts of revenge or retaliation. So they spread all over Greece, and they create sports clubs in all the urban centers of Greece: Athens, Salonika, Patras, Heraklion, Crete, Ebia Island, etc. They continue to use the same symbols and names that they used, in Istanbul. They used the double-headed Byzantine eagle, for example, as their emblem, and they used names which were containing the term Constantinople, Athletic Union of Constantinople, Pan-Thessalonikian Athletic Union of, etc. So this was the concept. The clubs of the Constantinopolitan were a lot, and they constitute, I would say, the second pillar of the refugee Greek sport. The one was the Smyrnian ones, from Izmir, Panionios, Apollo, the Armenian club of Izmir, Pelops of Karatas, and the other pillar was these clubs from Istanbul. They have a strong ideological and political background because they served as pool votes of the Liberal Party of Venizelos. Most of the members of their boards were candidates for Venizelos. For example, Spanoudis was a member of the parliament for the Liberals. So they created this network of sports clubs all over Greece, and they gave their support to Venizelos for almost a decade. The Greco-Turkish Treaty of 1930 divided them. So we had internal divisions. Some were supporting Venizelos for his initiative. Some other were saying, oh, he is the benefactor of the Turks now. Anyway, it's a phenomenon, I would say. The appearance, the activity of these clubs is a phenomenon in Greece. And nowadays, AEK, PAOK, these clubs have a pan-Hellenic, influence. And actually now they constitute the establishment of Greece, like Panathinaikos and Olympiakos. I think you ask also for those who remain. Here in Istanbul we have Kurtulus and Beyoglu, Spor Kulübü. Of course, their activity is not like it was before 1922. Of course, they made a lot, they offered a lot to Turkish, sports. Lefter Antoniadis, Küçük Lefter Antoniadis was, a legend. He was from the Greek community. He served, of course, Fenerbahce, some other clubs. But these two clubs are the remains of this tremendous activity. This is the reality for the past and for the present.
As a Fenerbahce fan, I can add, for example, and very strange to me too, since 1453, whenever we play with PAOK, with some other clubs from Greece, this is almost a strange tradition on the field since 1453. But I also know that, and also deeply feel that as a republicanist, I mean, the foundation of the club, or after Black Sox becoming new Turkish football club, I'm deeply knowing that Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and his ideology and his point of views about sport, about life, about modern Turkey, which are also so strong in our club. So these are some controversial, I mean, when you see that huge caricature on with the fans, this is maybe something similar, the revenge, what you mentioned before for the PAOK, for the other AYK, something from, or the base is different maybe from the past, very past, I mean the real past maybe, but after that new Turkish Republic of Turkey. Maybe this is a question for you too, this can be, is it similar in Greece as well for PAOK, for AYK, some other and modern Greece fans, or the point of views of fans are also important for these clubs too, or still since 1453 and the revenge deeply? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment and for the question. I will answer it as a fan of AYK of Athens and as a member of the scientific committee of the museum of the new stadium of AYK in Athens. For example, okay, I will answer for my team. There is not, yes, yeah, there is not any kind of hair trade, I can assure you about that. The grassroots of AYK, I would say that now is some kind of leftist grassroots and sentiment. You know, they started to operate as instruments of Venizalism in Greece, and AYK was founded by the elite of Constantinopolitan of Greece, lawyers, architects, you know, businessmen. You know, it was the, as you say, the kaimak of of society. So, but during the decades, the profile of AYK became more leftist. So there are more common things between our teams in both nations, and there is not any kind of hair trade, I can assure you. They share a common football tradition. There is not any kind of discourse that promote hair trade. We share everything in the field, and there is not any kind, you know, of revenge of anything. And you can see that if they are together in the stadium, they will sing together, and they will watch together, and afterwards they will go to Besiktas, you know, road, drink their beer together with not any kind of problem. And I invite you to come to Greece to see with us a football match in the new stadium of AYK Athens. And you will see the, yes, of course.
Okay, well, we can have a very long conversation about football here. Pardon, şurada bir soru var, sonra sizi de gördüm.
There is a question over here.
Geliyor değil mi siz?
Tuncer Duman. I have a question to Vahe Taşçıyan. I hope you can hear me, but I want to ask a question that also relates to this point in time, that also relates to today. In his presentation, Vahe Taşçıyan could find some hints and traces of how we can actually come to terms with genocide, what are the opportunities. However, with the proclamation of the Republic and all the way until the 2000s, there was no discussion about genocide. And one side of this issue was full of hatred, full of rage, with feelings of revenge, while on the other hand there was this mixed feeling of victory, triumph, but also shame. And they were all very much crystallized. But as of today, this sentiment of revenge or this sentiment of shame, how can we overcome this? What are your current observations and what is your take on how to overcome this as of today?
No? Okay. Well, let me try to paraphrase the question. I hope I'll do justice. Do you have any comments for the contemporary period, whether we could talk about this or discuss this issue of the genocide and all the atrocities, which would go beyond any feeling of shame and triumph and sort of getting back at one another? I guess that's what the question was.
It's difficult to. It's my turn to talk. It's addressed to me, the question.
Addressed to you.
Okay. Yeah, every time during conferences when there is a question related to the contemporary issues, I have difficulties to answer, but I will try. I think the simple thing is to talk about it, to discuss the matter as they discussed in the aftermath after the war, after the First World War, about the collective responsibilities, about the collective guilt, about individual guilt, and this happened also in Turkey in the last 10-15 years. But it's the most important issue on this matter is discussion. A matter should be discussed openly, and this is very important for any kind of reconciliation or any other such concepts.
Belma Saraç, ben emekli bir tarih öğretmeniyim.
Belma Saraç, I'm a retired teacher. I would like to ask to the last speaker, Mr. Vahe Taşçıyan.
There translation there? I'm told that there is translation that you can hear. I think you need to switch.
Interpreters in the conference hall continue interpreting. Interpreters in the conference hall continue interpreting. The speaker, Taşçıyan, joining via Zoom, needs to select interpretation setting.
Zoom original sound.
Well, if not, okay. I'll take the question and try to translate.
I'm very sorry.
So that save time. Siz buyurun.
Şimdi 19. yüzyıla gelinceye kadar her iki toplum
Until 1915, there was no problem between the communities. However, in the 19th century, all of a sudden, there is this new situation. I'm not even going to talk about ARF or Social Democrat Hınçak Party. Until the assassination attempt of Sultan Abdülhamit, there was certain unity. I wish that none of this would have happened, but what is the main turning point or breaking point? These are the two communities. They are in very good terms, so much to the extent that they can easily give their keys, home keys, to their neighbors. But what made them confront one another in such a way in the end of 19th century? And Artin Efendi was perhaps one of the most interesting MPs. He was a deputy from Aleppo, and he served as a deputy for 3 terms in the Ottoman Parliament. And at that time, he advocated women's rights, which may also be important for the next speaker. Artin Efendi openly expressed his opinion that he wished to see women deputies in the Ottoman Parliament. After the 1918 Mudros armistice, I was curious what Artin Efendi was up to. I wonder if Mr. Taşçıyan has any information whatsoever about the whereabouts of Artin Efendi after 1918.
No, I'm very sorry.
Okay.
No.
Okay, let me see. 2 questions, very briefly. What do you think is really the breaking point between two communities? What happens in 19th century that actually leads to such leading to a breaking point between 2 communities? I mean, Armenians and Turks. And the second question is about Artin Efendi, who was a very vocal person in the parliament, and what happens to him after 1918, right? That's the question. Mm-hmm. Do you know anything about post 1918?
Yes. What happened to create a break between 2 communities? The simple word is genocide, yeah, and I don't have another answer for that. And for the second question, yes, it's very, very interesting what happened later to Artin Efendi. Not personally, not physically what happened to him, but what happened to persons like Artin Efendi in the collective memory of the Armenians. He was forgotten. He was forgotten like many other Armenians who believed that Armenians should continue to live side by side with the Turks, and they struggled for that. And even after the genocide, in post-genocide times, they struggled for that coexistence between Turks and Armenians. And what is interesting, in fact, I studied Artin Efendi's history, or Artin Efendi's issue, in a book which was published a couple of years ago, and it wasn't about Artin Efendi, but at the end of the book is what happened to persons like Artin Efendi in the collective memory of the Armenians. He was from Aintab. He was a member of the parliament from Aleppo, and we know that during the genocide he helped many Armenians from Aintab not to be deported to Deir Zor, not to be killed during the deportations, and so he helped his community, and it was a very important help during that period, contribution of that period. But when we see books published on the history of Aintab Armenians, or when we check another book, which is a book where you can find hundreds of biographies about Aintab Armenians, there is no trace of Artin Efendi Boshkezenian. And so he died in Aleppo in 1923, I think, or 1923, and he was forgotten. And he's not the only person who was forgotten. And this is the reason why the Armenian historiography, like Turkish historiography, is a restructured historiography. It's some members or some actors who were very active and very important in pre-genocide times are forgotten in post-genocide periods because of their ideology, because of their actions, and it was against the ideology which was settled in in post-genocide times. This is the case of Armenian historiography, and the place of persons like Artin Efendi, there was no place for him in these new conditions.
Benim bir sorum var son.
One last question from my side to Sona, unless there are other questions from our audience.
For you, I mean, this might be a long discussion, so maybe we can talk about the details later. But I was curious about AWA's efforts in getting back the abducted woman, because it is also, I mean, there are similar examples in different parts of the world. The example that I have in mind is the partition of India, and later, you know, all these regulations and laws for the abducted woman, and I'm curious about in a way the procedure, you know, how they went along to identify. Because it's a very complicated process, and for example, the Indian government had to, you know, go through many procedures to identify, which was very problematic as well. But so I was curious about the procedure.
Thank you for the question. The reason I titled the research question between Turkish public and Turkish private institutions is because I wanted to show that these orphan gathering missions were something that were very, very private, they were inside the Turkish family, because these women have been already integrated into Turkish harems and Turkish family structures. So the reason Armenian Women's Foundation was so integral to these orphan gathering missions was because the men couldn't get into the families, Turkish families. It was not appropriate for the men go into these families. The women could go into these families and conduct these orphan gathering missions. And of course, sometimes they didn't know if this person was Armenian or not. There is even this anecdote that Dr. Lerna Ekmekçoğlu mentions in her book, where two people talk to each other and they're like, the Turks have Islamized and Turkified so many of us. What if we Armenianize one of them? So that's not going to change anything. So you're right that there wasn't like a particular way to identify who was Armenian, and because one of the reasons why they changed the patrilinearity laws and decided that any child born from an Armenian woman was Armenian was because they didn't know, they just didn't know who the fathers of these children were, and they wanted, you know, to keep these children in the community and not to give up these children to Turkish or other families, that's like mainly it. Yeah.
I think we will wrap it up now, and thank you to our panelists. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone. Pardon, bir son soru var anladım.
One last question, I'm very sorry. I didn't see our audience. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Sadık Çağatay is my name. Based on these discussions about the actual starting point for deportations and genocide, during the French Revolution, I know that there was increased adoption of nationalism. There was increased popularity of nationalistic ideas, which also became quite popular in Turkey. And Kadir Mısırlıoğlu, historian, also argues that after this nationalism, after the idea of nationalism became rampant, then genocide had to happen in a way. So I would like to learn about your opinion on that. This is quite a broad.
For everyone, the one idea that has been proposed was that, you know, these genocides start with the idea of nationalism. would you comment on that? Is that the relationship between nationalisms and, any kind of nationalism? I mean, it's a very broad question, but... Oh, Vahe already left. No. Oh, is he here? There? Okay. Vahe, do you want to comment on this?
No. Sure. I think nationalism is a very important factor to any genocide. Yeah. And,
arkadaşlar ben duyamıyorum hiçbir şey. Pardon, özür dilerim.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Vahe, please.
Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, I was saying that, sure, the factor of nationalism is very important of any genocide that happened in the world in history. Nationalism, social nationalism, and so everything related to nationalism is a very important factor. Yeah, and so yes, I agree with the. It was a question or a comment? I didn't understand.
Broad question, yes. Okay,
so,
but I think we
yes.
the answer. The answer is yes. Thank you. Teşekkürler.